Well, hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of our latest report, Welcome to the Machine. And this is a report about the use of generative artificial intelligence in education. And of course, over the last couple of years, we would have all heard a lot about the rise of AI, starting with ChatGPT, but then continued with other products like Claude, like Gemini. So suddenly everybody is talking about that brave new world of artificial intelligence. And many people are asking themselves what it means, especially for education. And we are fortunate at the initiative to have an absolute education specialist in Michael Johnston in our team. And so we asked Michael to look into this for us. And the result is the report we are launching today. So what we want to do in this webinar is we want to, of course, hear from Michael, but we are also extremely privileged to have an expert commentator on this issue, and that's Barbara Oakley. So let me just introduce our two speakers. So Michael, the author of the report, is a senior fellow here at the New Zealand Initiative. He's a cognitive psychologist by background. And before joining the initiative a couple of years ago, he was the Associate Dean Academic at Victoria University of Wellington in the Faculty of Education. And Michael leads our work on education here at the initiative, and you will probably know him from many of his other reports we've launched over the last couple of years. And then we're really privileged to have our adjunct senior fellow, Barbara Oakley, with us. And Barbara is actually a professor of engineering at Auckland University in Rochester, Michigan, from which she joins us today. But actually, we have not invited Barbara as an engineer as much as an educator, because she is a passionate educator. Her work focuses on the complex relationship between neuroscience and social behavior. Her research has been described as revolutionary by the Wall Street Journal. She is a New York Times best-selling author, and she leads one of the world's largest online courses, Learning How to Learn. And in that capacity, we've invited Barbara as a commentator onto this podcast, and we are super excited that Barbara will actually be joining us here at the initiative in Wellington next year on a sabbatical. And so this is an early chance for all of you initiative followers to actually get a glimpse of Barbara and see how good she is. So we are really excited to have you both on this webinar. Reminder, this report, Welcome to the Machine, you can find on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. And before we start, just one last housekeeping thing. Behind Michael, you'll see a Slido number, and that is for you to log your questions. So if you go to slido.com and you put in the number 4019243, you can ask your questions, and we'll get to that in the Q&A part of this webinar later. You can also vote on questions that other people have asked, so we know what are the most burning issues that you would like to have discussed. So slido.com 4019243. But that's it for now from me. And now I invite Michael Johnston to please launch your report and tell us what it's all about. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and welcome everybody to the webinar, and especially to Professor Barbara Oakley. I'm so happy that you could join us today, and I know that you'll have some very interesting reflections. So, as Oliver alluded in his introduction, artificial intelligence is a very fast-moving technology. I suppose it came into popular consciousness about a year and a half ago, and since then it has grown very quickly with a proliferation of different products of increasing sophistication, and its development over time is unpredictable. We can guess at what it's going to become capable of, but we don't yet know. And perhaps the most famous or well-known kind of AI at the moment is generative large language models, otherwise known as chatbots, which have well and truly passed Alan Turing's Turing test, which is the ability of a technology to pass as human. Certainly the responses that generative large language models give us are easily pass muster in that respect. But large language models are not the only kind of artificial intelligence. We also have products that produce art and pictures, and the possibilities are quite limitless. So when it comes to thinking about how it might be adopted into education, it's important to have a long-term view and to have in mind the unpredictability of the way that technology will unfold. And so therefore, rather than trying to deal with just the existing capabilities of AI, I'm thinking about a principle that will hold teachers and educators in good stead as the technology continues to evolve. So I guess a good thing to start with is to think about the way in which AI, like other technologies, occurs to us as human beings when they're first invented, which is that we look to all of the amazing possibilities that the technology seems to afford and perhaps don't consider enough the risks. Now, there are some great opportunities for education, and I'll come to those, but I think it's worth talking through the risks first because of some of the rather utopian thinking that I've heard mostly from tech entrepreneurs rather than educators. I think educators probably have a more measured view, but there is some fairly utopian thinking coming through. And in particular, the idea that the technology can free us or free young people of the need to learn difficult things and instead free them to use critical thinking and creativity, this kind of thing. But my argument is that actually none of those things are possible without a store of knowledge of one's own. So I want to turn to the science of learning as a way to guide us as we think about how artificial intelligence can be adopted responsibly into education. And in particular, to note that the first thing that happens when we start to learn something is that we deal with it in what is known as our working memory. Now, working memory is a short-term store, and it decays quickly, and it hasn't got a very large capacity. So you can't deal with very much information in your working memory, yet that's where we store information and knowledge while we're using it. So to support structured learning, to learn mathematics, to learn reading, to learn just about anything, we have to commit that knowledge to long-term memory so that we can build on it. If we don't, then working memory becomes overloaded and we end up experiencing cognitive overload, feelings of confusion, and then young people eventually will disengage with learning if they're subjected to cognitive overload for too long. So the risk is that if artificial intelligence is allowed to do things for students before they're able to do them for themselves, then they won't learn to do those things for themselves. They won't commit those skills, that knowledge to long-term memory, and then the edifice of their learning will be unstable, and they won't actually be properly educated. We can think back to the calculator debate of the 1980s for a case in point. At that stage, calculators had just become affordable, handheld calculators, and everybody just about had one. And there was a school of thought in education at the time that this advent of calculators meant that learning arithmetic was less important than it had been because children could easily use the calculator. But of course, bearing in mind what I said about working memory, long-term memory, and cognitive load, if young people don't learn arithmetic, then they don't have the store of knowledge and long-term memory that they need to build on to learn more advanced mathematics. And so they're forever disadvantaged in mathematics by that. Now, with artificial intelligence at the moment, with the large language models, I guess the immediate threat is to the learning of writing, because artificial intelligence can produce very nicely written prose. It can write better than just about any school student, and for that matter, better than just about any adult. So there may be a temptation for people to think, why do children need to learn to write now? If they can just give their ideas to artificial intelligence and get it to produce a nice piece of writing, why would they need that skill for themselves? Well, writing is vitally important, not only as a means of communication, but also as a support to thinking. So bearing in mind the limitations of working memory, what being able to write well does is give us the ability to put our thoughts outside our heads, as it were, for easy reference. So we have effectively increased the capacity of working memory. We don't actually increase its capacity, but by getting the thoughts out on paper or out on a screen, we're able to reference them, develop them, and think about them without experiencing cognitive overload. So one argument here is that learning to write remains vitally important. Knowledge more generally is also important. So for a while, there's been a little bit of discourse around knowledge, 21st century learning, saying that we can look up knowledge on the internet. So why do children need to have that structure of knowledge in place for themselves? Well, in many ways, I've already answered that question. It's once again to free working memory for learning. And without the knowledge, there's no basis for critical thinking, no basis for creative thinking. Knowledge is the raw material for both of those things. So the argument of the report really is that artificial intelligence does not fundamentally change what young people need to learn. It may make some differences around the edges. They may need to learn to use artificial intelligence in a productive and responsible way, for example. But in terms of the basic knowledge that they need, that won't change. So instead of trying to use artificial intelligence in a way that fundamentally revolutionizes education, it's better to adopt it in a way that supports education. So I think it was Paul Bloom around the 1980s who posed what he called the 2 sigma problem. Research had shown that young people given one-on-one tutoring performed about 2 standard deviations above the average of a child not given individual tutoring, hence the 2 sigma problem, sigma being the Greek letter used to designate the standard deviation. So that's a very large increase in the educational productivity that we could get from giving every child an individual tutor. The 2 sigma problem is that we can't afford to do that, or at least we couldn't until perhaps the advent of artificial intelligence. Now, I don't think it's at the stage yet where it can be used in that way, but it shows great promise in that regard. A caveat is that it must always be used under the supervision of a knowledgeable and skilled teacher. For a start, it can make mistakes, it can go wrong, so it needs guidance to use it safely. But also, we have to watch out for the possibility that it starts to be used in ways that are undesirable. Young people are very innovative and they will find ways to use it that you didn't expect, that we didn't expect. So very important to keep an eye on it, but a potentially powerful tool if rather than giving children the answers to problems, say in mathematics, that they've got wrong, it leads them through their thinking to find their own mistakes. That's a powerful use of it. It could potentially ask them questions about some writing that they've done to deepen their thinking. In other words, it could behave the way a good human tutor does. And I think that's the really promising thing about it. Just as a final note, I want to mention social education. I think another risk of artificial intelligence, especially for young people who are experiencing a bit of social awkwardness, as many teenagers do, if the artificial intelligence bots come across as being their friends, as caring about them, and it's easy to get fooled into thinking that because they're very friendly in their tone and so on, that poses another risk. So we've got to be really careful not to allow young people's social lives to be overtaken by artificial intelligence, arguably as they've already been taken over by social media. Technology does pose all kinds of risks unless we keep a close eye on it. So I'd counsel the Ministry of Education and other educational authorities to be monitoring closely as this technology is introduced, and to make sure that we do have some guiding principles for educators. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very interested to hear what Professor Oakley thinks about the report and to hear her reflections on it.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for this introduction. Just a reminder to everybody listening, you can ask your questions via the Slido number behind Michael. That's 4019243. Just put it in on slido.com, and you can also vote on everybody else's questions. But for now, I look forward to hearing from Barbara Oakley. Barbara, over to you.
Okay, it's my pleasure because this is such an important report. And the reason, maybe I should step back and provide a little bit of context. As Michael had mentioned, in the 1970s, when calculators first came out, there wasn't the insight that we have now from cognitive psychologists about how does the brain really work and how do we learn effectively. And the consequence of that was an overwhelming push towards we don't need to teach kids the multiplication tables. We should have whole language approaches to learning how to read. And these approaches have actually created a number of problems over the recent decades. In fact, one surprise was they found that IQ scores have increased from the 1930s to the 1970s. But then after the 1970s, IQ scores began decreasing. Why was that? Well, it turns out that when that's the time when calculators came out and people began to not have to remember things or memorize things or have knowledge embedded in their minds because they could always look things up. So it created a real problem in education in the long term. And Michael's report sort of gives us background in what we know now about how we really learn, that gives insight that says, don't just jump onto the ChatGPT can do everything bandwagon so that we don't need to teach our children any of these kinds of skills like writing. We do need to have them be actually working and practicing and still learning the basics of these skills. So it was a pleasure for me to read the report. And what was helpful as well, though, is that we can actually better understand what's going on with generative AI by viewing it through a lens of cognitive science. In some sense, that habitual pathway or the automatic pathways of learning that are seated largely in the basal ganglia, these pathways of learning for automatic things we do quickly without thinking of them are very much akin to the kinds of neural processing that happens with artificial intelligence and the transformers that are at the heart of artificial intelligence. So if we kind of understand that artificial intelligence is like that habitual automatic way we have of thinking, whereas artificial intelligence does not have so much that conscious declarative ability to work step by step through problems. And if that is missing, it's more or less the equivalent of having a lobotomy. So we have this AI out there that can do all sorts of great things, but it also is running around with a lobotomy. It doesn't have a conscious sort of mind that is overviewing what's going on. And I love how Michael says, treat AI as an assistant rather than a colleague. This is very true, but you could think of it as a colleague that's slightly deranged if you wanted to. So be wary of that slightly deranged colleague. There's so many really worthwhile and ideas that are being brought up in this. We do need to be careful of AI, but at the same time, the report is not sort of all negative and all wary of AI in any way. It's like a big tidal wave. It's coming in whether we like it or not. And so that means that we need to grapple with it and use it appropriately. And that's part of what I love about how Michael is dispassionately laying out these different areas where AI will have an impact. So it's well worth reading. I think that one very interesting idea that was within the report was just the idea that critical thinking is very, very important. Critical thinking is that way of thinking consciously and deliberately about a problem, for example, to solve it. If you're getting something back from AI, if you are unable to think critically about the data that you are being given, the facts that it's putting forth, you can very easily be fooled. So it does surprise me. Oftentimes there's very little critical thinking oftentimes being taught in classrooms around the world. And I think this report really reinforces the idea that critical thinking is really important, and it will become even more important with the tremendous growth of AI. How do we solve the cheating problem? That's always something I think that everyone is very interested in and is alluded to. Right now, it seems that the best way to solve it is to have your students in your eye as they're producing what you want them to be producing. The reality is, in the world of education, we have just experienced the equivalent of a sort of a metaphorical nuclear bomb that has just destroyed most of the ways that we ever used to evaluate students. So you can see that teachers would be a little bit worried in that they suddenly have had the rug pulled out from under them, and nobody's quite sure about how to evaluate. But at the same time, I can't help but think that this may be an opportunity, because I remember the real good students who were truly interested in the material, they actually struggled sometimes. For example, when I was studying engineering, because the professors were so stingy about sharing answers. They didn't want the students to have answers to previous tests or anything like that. And so that meant that they didn't have practice materials to go with. Now, suddenly, students who really do want to learn can get these materials a lot more easily. And so if we can find ways to evaluate students as teachers, even so, we may find to our surprise that some students will have benefited from having these easy access to materials. So I thank you for this wonderfully thought-provoking report. It's really given me insight into what the future may hold, and at the same time, it has a very calm and dispassionate way of saying we don't really know what the future will hold. So it alludes to the excitement ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you very much for your kind words about the report. Just as a reminder, you can find the report on our website at nzinitiative.org.nz. But for now, it's time for the Q&A session of this webinar, and the questions are coming in via Slido. Once again, reminder, you can ask your own questions, slido.com 1499243. The most popular question right now is actually a statement. I believe you must distinguish between AI, that's been around for 15 years or longer, versus generative AI, which generates new content. And actually, I think 15 years is an understatement, because the first forms of AI, I believe, happened in the 1940s or 50s. But this generative bit is new, and we must distinguish between that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Michael?
Well, it does generate certainly what you could call something new, but we need to bear in mind that it's been trained on existing text. So AI doesn't know anything. Well, arguably it doesn't know anything. The technology itself goes back probably to the 1960s. Actually, it had its roots in cognitive psychology, which is, once again, my field, the field that the science of learning comes out of. And at the time, the modelers were called connectionists, and they made little networks with about 3 layers with, a few dozen nodes. And they could do simple things like recognize letters or words, eventually a few objects, this kind of thing. So they'd classify things based on a coded input into the top layer. And then there was something called a hidden layer, and then an output layer. And they were trained by producing first random output, and then that was compared with what the answer should have been, and that was put back into the network, and the weights, the little connections between the nodes were adjusted accordingly. And over lots of training, they learned to classify things pretty well. Well, now we have the generative models that have hundreds of layers, billions of nodes, but they're trained in similar ways using huge corpuses of text. So do they produce something new? Arguably they do, but actually what they're doing is statistically predicting what the next most likely word or language element is in the response sentence. So I don't think that they're creative in a human sense. I think they can put together remarkably lucid text. That's beyond doubt. And you definitely have the feeling of having a conversation with the better ones. But I'm not sure that there's a fundamental difference actually between what they're calling generative models and the previous ones, because in the end, they're being trained with pre-existing text and reproducing things based on statistical likelihoods from that. That's a bit of a technical answer, but it was kind of a technical question.
Barbara, would you like to comment?
I'd like to just show an illustration. So just what I think is so interesting and cool, and that's such a great point, because I think sometimes we just leave the generative off because it's, kind of, oh, wait, what am I? Looks like I'm stuck here a bit. Can you still hear me?
Oh, yes.
We can hear you.
Okay. Looks like oh, there we are. Okay. So we're right here, and let's see, I'm trying to find you. You're in Zoom, and so you should be right here, and I'm trying to find my Zoom link, which has suddenly disappeared. Where are you? Okay, there. Okay, now, okay. There we go. Sorry about that. That was supposed to be a very quick but what is neat is that if you look at transformers are the heart of generative AI. And the way the information flows through those transformers is actually shockingly similar to the way that information flows through the cortex, through the brain. And so it can be really interesting and helpful to know a little bit, as Michael is explaining to us in his report, about how the human brain works, because that actually can help give insight into how generative AI is working with that wonderful transformer that's at the heart of generative AI. Interestingly, this transformer was first introduced in a paper from 2017 called Attention is All You Need. And when this paper was presented, nobody thought it was even worthwhile. It was at the Neuroinformation Processing Society meeting. And so they kind of stuck it off in a corner or gave them a poster to put on. Now it's been cited over 100,000 times. And so it's quite it's quite revolutionary in what it's done for society and for the development of generative AI.
And let's just ask the next question, which really follows on from what you just discussed. How can educators and policymakers ensure that the use of AI in education is grounded in the science of learning and cognition?
Well, they have to monitor it themselves. So we mustn't let young people just use it in any old way, and nor must we use any old product. So I'm extremely in favor of developing special purpose AIs for education that have appropriate safeguards. I do mention one in the report, that's Khan Migo from the Khan Academy. As I understand, that's still under development because it's actually quite hard to get it right. But one of the interesting things about Khan Migo is that it's actually two AIs. There's one that interacts with a student, and there's another that is a kind of supervisor of that AI that's interacting with the student. And the supervising AI will do things like say, don't give them the answer, lead them through their reasoning. So it will kind of issue educative instructions to the main AI that will then make sure, do those things. And it can do pretty amazing things. There's a rather striking example, which I write about in the report, where it's an example of a student who's studying F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, and is asking questions about what Gatsby's motivations are for certain things, and the AI puts on the persona of Gatsby and speaks using his idiom and so on, and really draws the student in. And, in the end, its answers are no better than a teacher's would be, or perhaps somebody else who read the novel, but it's engaging for a student to interact with, and does get them thinking about characters in novels, for example. So I think it's really a matter of using the right tools and making sure that they're under the supervision of teachers, both in terms of how they're used and in terms of looking, just making sure that the output is not going off into some hallucination, which AI is capable of.
And with that, Michael, you have almost answered the next question already. So I might just put that to you, Barbara. What can we do so that AI will be used to support teachers and how they teach students rather than replace them?
Well, I think the best thing to do is to create online courses that can reach out quickly to a great number of teachers and give them insight into how they can use AI to make their lives easier, to make their teaching more effective. It's got so many, we need the teachers, but teachers can always use some assistance to make their lives easier. And if you have a tool that can help you write a good lesson plan to help answer questions, perhaps about a new subject that you're teaching, to help, for example, when I was recently in Mongolia, they asked me, how do we teach students who are just right off the Mongolian steppe and they have absolutely no interest in learning Python programming? Well, go into ChatGPT and ask it, how can I get my students straight off the Mongolian steppe interested in Python programming? It immediately came up with great examples of how herding can apply to certain applications in Python programming and yurts and so forth. So I could never have come up with something like that. And sometimes our students are coming from a place that we really can't access very easily, but some of the Gen AI can help us with that. So the more teachers can learn about how to use it, and the more we can help them learn, the more they'll see it makes their teaching jobs so much easier.
Great, thank you. Next question is, Radio New Zealand recently reported that generative AI such as ChatGPT will often present untruths as truth. How do we support students to discern between the two? Question for you, Michael, and probably it's not just happening on ChatGPT.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, we hear a lot about misinformation and the and disinformation, and the idea that we need to control the information flow to cut out, wrong ideas and so on. But that will never work. Censorship never works. What does work is young people having a store of knowledge of their own, so that they have a reasonable operational model of the world for themselves. And I think it was Neil Postman, the American media critic, who wrote a book in the early 1970s, I think, with a guy called Brett Weingartner, and they contended that the purpose of education is to install bullshit detectors in young people. So, and really that is both knowledge and as Barb says, critical thinking. But, critical thinking does not occur in the abstract. Critical thinking is developed through studying disciplines like science and history, and for that matter, literary studies and all the other things that form the basis of the kind of classical education. Those things are not arbitrary. They've developed in our cultures for a very long period of time, with methods for testing truth claims, for testing ideas. And part of that is learning to argue well, learning to debate things with others, because actually we come up with better ideas when we debate them between ourselves than we'll ever come up with sitting on our own. But also learning the methods by which ideas are generated and tested in these disciplines. That actually is sophisticated critical thinking, and that's where it comes from. And that, to me, is the best armor that we can give young people against misinformation and disinformation, whether it's generated by, chat bots on the internet or just human beings who are trying to lead people astray. It doesn't matter. There's no way to shut down access to that kind of thing. And it's been around forever, by the way. There's always been con artists who have tried to lead people astray. The best way to counter it is with knowledge and the critical thinking that comes from studying disciplines.
Thank you, Michael. The next question I can actually answer myself. How do we access the report? Well, it's on our website. It's right on the front page of our website, nzinitiative.org.nz, and you can download a PDF copy of the report there. Next question then is, how can AI be used to support learning of neurodiverse students? Any ideas on that? Maybe Barbara, you start first.
I'd love to. Just one comment on the previous question, and that relates to sometimes what I do when I can tend to write emails that can be very straightforward and perhaps a bit not as good a tone as I might have wished. So sometimes I will go into ChatGPT and say, can you tell me what might be irritating in this email, and give me a version that perhaps gets the point across, but in a milder way. And it's amazing how much you learn about your own writing by using these tools for this kind of thing. But where for neurodiverse students, what it can do is, for one thing, it's extremely patient. So a regular tutor can get a little bit squirrely when you just don't quite get it, but generative AI can take and give you insights from a number of different directions. So even if the student is struggling with their learning, say they have a lesser capacity working memory, they can help with that situation. What I would do is I would go right into my favorite one for getting interesting answers that aren't quite, maybe they contain something a bit unexpected, is Claude 3. So that one is by Anthropic. It's sort of backed by Amazon way back there. But I would go to Claude 3 and I would go to ChatGPT. I would compare their answers when I asked them the question, how can I use generative AI to help my student, my neurodiverse student who perhaps has dyslexia or is on the spectrum? And you will be surprised at some of the insights that it will provide for you. So I would say just go right out and ask that question and see what it says.
Michael?
Yeah, so of course there are many different ways of being neurodiverse, so it's hard to give a generic answer. I really liked Professor Oakley's point that it's endlessly patient. I think that's a really good aspect of it. Along with that comes a little bit of a warning, which I alluded to before, which is that we don't want it to displace normal social activity between young people. And there is a risk of that if somebody is not socially confident. The AI can be seen as a safe haven for a kind of virtual friend, but of course it isn't a friend. And I think it's really important for us to impress on young people that AI might seem friendly and it's a good tool, but it doesn't have the capacity to care about you or to be your friend really. But nonetheless, as a tutor, it is endlessly patient. I think that's a really big thing. Perhaps it can be adaptive to the way in which particular children learn, whether they're classified as neurodiverse or not. If it can detect patterns in the way a young person is thinking and the way they attack problems and so on, then it can tune itself to their particular idiosyncrasies, whether, again, they're neurodiverse or just within the normal spectrum of variation.
The next question is rather a statement, but I wonder whether you'd like to comment on that. Paul asks, at a school level, especially secondary school, students and parents equate educational quality with assessment outcomes, and AI will enable better results in assignments. Do you think that's true?
Well, enable better, it depends on the assignment. I mean, ideally, of course, if they're learning more, they should do better in assignments. I guess here we have to distinguish between what's known as teaching to the test or kind of narrowly focusing on the assessment outcomes and coaching young people to be able to do well on those narrow outcomes versus the broad base of learning that good results will still emanate from, but which is also, a connected up kind of learning. So I think it's really important that we foster the latter and don't allow AI to take over the former. Now, having said all of this, and in part just thinking back to my previous answer about neurodiverse learners, if an AI has perhaps an adjunct app or software that enables tracking of progression over time in a particular skill or a particular field of knowledge, then the AI can actually do two things with that. First of all, it can make sure that material that it's presenting or interacting with the student over is appropriately pitched at their level of proficiency, or actually you want it to be just a little bit in advance of their level of proficiency, so they're developing into it. That's kind of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development idea, that we want to be challenging students at all times, but also potentially even assessing them as they go. Now, assessment has two important purposes. I would say the most fundamental and important is formative. That means it's collecting information on where a student is now and what they need next to keep them learning and keep them going. The other is credentialing, which certainly is important too. That's assessment for qualifications. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near this, but it is potentially the case that AI could actually be able to tell when a student had reached a certain level of proficiency in a particular domain of knowledge and issue a credential. Now, there's all sorts of fishhooks with that, and it's very much speculative thinking, but there's a possibility there.
Okay, I've got a very practical question for you, Michael. Have educators been consulted or contributed to the report? And if so, which ones? And has the Ministry of Education encapsulated AI in the curriculum refresh?
Well, I've listened to a lot of webinars on the internet and done a lot of reading on this report. I must say this report is one that I've kind of developed my own thinking on rather than consulting widely. So it's not something that I've talked to a great many educators about during the development of. I've talked to some, but really this was a way of developing my own thinking, as it were. So it's not one that I've done a lot of consultation on.
Okay. Next
But if I
question.
can add,
Yes,
though,
Barbara.
it falls beautifully in line with what we know from cognitive science, and it helps us really understand better what's going on with Gen AI. So it's just, I think it's beautifully informative and really well thought out. So in that sense, sometimes, I don't know if you have found this yourself, but sometimes what I find is reports that are put together by massive committees generally don't really say much of anything. It's all sort of very pablum, watered down, the weakest possible statements. And I think AI is moving so fast that we don't have time to have a committee, sort of trying to figure out this swift moving thing. It can be helpful to have a very perceptive person kind of give us insights that are grounded in what we know from science.
I should say, actually, many thanks to Microsoft, who did host some forums for us at the beginning of the process for this report, and we did get some input from quite a number of teachers and educators at that stage. So thanks to Microsoft for that.
Cool. Next question, and I think we touched on this already a little bit. How do we ensure assessment actually allows us to see what skills have been acquired? Do we need more self-reflection on that?
More self-reflection.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to, Barbara's already talked about the threats to traditional forms of assessment, and I've talked a little bit about ways in which AI might help us develop new forms of assessment. I think that is a puzzle. And it's where, I guess, the AI debate in education started. The immediate anxiety was, well, now how are we going to assess young people if they can just get an AI engine to produce their responses? And I don't think we've quite solved that problem. As Professor Oakley said, perhaps the best way is to be invigilating them when they're doing their assessments so that we know they're not using it. But I think we can get more creative than that over time, perhaps by using AI itself to be, if we can get it to that point where it's reliable enough to issue credentials or at least indicators that a student is ready to be credentialed in a particular area. But it's very hard to say. I think we haven't begun really to grapple with that puzzle properly yet.
The next question I have is actually for Barbara, I think, and I might want to widen the question a bit. Someone asked, what will our children need to know about AI? And if I could add, what will we all need to know about AI, Barbara?
Oh, as much as reasonably possible, I should say. But one thing this is kind of, if you've been around AI, you'll hear this metaphor, and it's a very good one, which is that learning how to use AI or generative AI is sort of like learning how to drive a car. If you look underneath the engine, there are different, underneath the hood, there's different engines. So we've got ChatGPT, we've got Claude, we've got Pi, we've got, different ones. But actually, if you learn to drive, you can use any of those engines, and there are minor differences, but it's not that big a deal. So the development of courses about how to responsibly use generative AI is a really important thing to be doing. What I see now is businesses are leaping aboard because they see the advantages of AI, and it really is, generative AI is super helpful. But I think there is a understandable bias amongst educators against generative AI because, you just blow up all our assessment methods. So we have to kind of work to overcome that, even as we are developing better assessment methods. And that means developing new courses where before we may have been teaching about coding, now we would be teaching about things like how to use generative AI.
So
And
do you think that schools should actually teach prompt engineering? And isn't that one of the cases where maybe the students know more than the teachers these days?
it could well be. One idea that is of value is we can get so overwhelmed with, oh, I'm not a computer scientist, I don't know how to program. Well, artists, great artists, they're not chemists. They don't know how to mix up all the pigments, necessarily. They don't know all the chemistry behind how you do all of the creation of pigments and so forth. You can be a great artist without that knowledge. And with this marvelous new tool of generative AI, for good or for ill, we have a tool that it doesn't matter so much if you don't really understand some of the underlying concepts about how it operates. If you just learn some of the ideas related to, as Oliver mentioned, prompt engineering and how it can go awry, how to catch it when it goes awry, what happens during the training of different platforms and foundational models. Learning a little bit about these kinds of things is like learning, different skills related to learning to drive a car. And as soon everyone will be expected to know these kinds of things.
Yeah, I'd say definitely young people don't need to know, in detail how the AI engines work. I think it's helpful that they know in broad principles so that they don't mistakenly think that the AI holds knowledge itself or something like that. I think it's important to know just the general principles of how it works so they're not led astray by it.
Okay. Question from Tom Flanagan. Now that generative AI can create cogent writing on demand, what approach to teaching writing do you recommend? Michael?
Same as ever, really. I wouldn't yet let young people of, early primary age really interact with AI. I think we should have learned the lessons from social media on that one. You've got, we have debates in this office about the validity of John Haidt's work, but I actually think he's got a real point about the damage that I think social media can do to especially teenage girls and in the way they interact. I think it's there in the mental health data. But in any event, we've just got to be really careful about how we introduce these tools and when. And certainly with writing, for the first few years, I wouldn't see anything changing. In fact, I would like to see us return to early handwriting, because there's very good evidence that promotes not only the ability to write well later on, but actually the ability to read. And that's because of neural connections that learning to write forms between the speech and language areas of the brain, which you don't get from tapping keyboards because all of the keys are the same. Whereas when you're forming a letter, it's a different shape for every letter, and that matters. So, and likewise, later skills of composition and putting together your arguments in written form still need to be learned. So I don't see it actually fundamentally changing the way we teach writing.
Barbara, any thoughts? If not, I've got the next question for you. Could you please suggest some online courses to teach teachers how to use AI? I'm sure these courses exist, and I'm sure if anyone knows about them, it's you, Barbara.
Some great ones. I'm a little biased since my courses are on Coursera, but if you go to the Coursera platform, that's Coursera, Coursera, and look for generative AI and look for Julian White has an excellent course for teachers, one on prompt engineering, one to help you get started as you're teaching. And just look for some of the generative AI courses that they have there, and you'll find some great, great tools and ideas that will walk you through. I'll be speaking for Oxford university in 2 weeks. So there's a really nice starting primer that evening in Oxford. So there's lots of good materials out there. Just start watching it and kind of approach it with fun in mind, and you'll have a lot of fun.
And that was on Coursera.com, is that right?
Yeah.
I'll put that in the chat so anyone can click on the link. And the name of the person that you mentioned?
Julian White.
Julian.
I'm a fan of Julian White.
Good.
So he is
Put that here too.
excellent.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Next question. I wonder who that is for. Is there a role for Gen AI assessment tools to assist in doing skill gap analysis to be done at the point of new employment induction for employers?
There's potential for that, for sure. I don't think we've got to the point where we necessarily trust AI to do that. It's important, of course, that technology not only can do something, but is trusted to do it. And if you're going to use it for something high stakes like that, then it's important that both the people, the employers and the potential employees think it's a reasonable way to do things. So I think that AI really has to prove itself. But I mean, in theory, it's a very good use of it, right? That kind of gap analysis. What is it alludes to what I was saying before about perhaps having a parallel tool that has a kind of measurement scale for skill or knowledge in a particular domain, and then the AI interacting with someone to see where they sit on that scale. And then if you have a criterion scale, we'd like you to be here, but you're only there, then we're able to provide support to learn and improve. So I think, yes, there's that's a real potential, but I don't think that we're there yet, either in terms of the technology itself or certainly in the trust in the technology.
Okay. Next question. Does generative AI exhibit biases in education and promote fairness across cultural, racial, and ethnic groups?
There's some interesting work from David Rosado, who's at the Southland branch of, the Otago branch of Te Pukenga. And he's done some work on the political biases of AI. And certainly he finds that they have political biases, and also that you can move them around fairly easily with using kind of open AI tools. So see, it all comes down to what kinds of texts they've been trained on. And so if you feed them a lot of left-wing material, then they'll give left-wing answers. If you feed them a lot of right-wing material, they'll give right-wing answers. So the biases, they're not intrinsically biased, but they will be biased by the material you train them on.
If I could ask you both just one final question, or maybe take Michael first, and then we'll go to you, Barbara. If you think about generative AI, this is a relatively recent journey for most of us, starting a couple of years ago with ChatGPT, now going to all these other tools. But if you think now where we might be in, say, 10 years' time in our schools, do you think our schools will be fundamentally changed by this generative AI development? Will teaching be fundamentally changed? And if you look into the future now, I mean, this has only been 2 years, but where will we be in the long run?
Well, I think that the kind of take-home message from the report is that I wouldn't like to see education fundamentally changed in terms of what young people learn, but I do think that there are enormous opportunities for teachers to use these tools to improve their productivity and their practice. So again, I don't want to see teachers displaced by these tools at all. That would be a disaster. But I do think that teachers can learn to use them and to supervise their students using them in ways that will enhance education as it's been in the past. That young people still need to learn knowledge. They still need to learn to write for themselves. And that's in support of these important skills of critical thinking and creative thinking.
Indeed. And Barbara, what are your thoughts? What are your hopes? What are your fears? Where do you think we're going to be in 10 years' time with AI?
Oh, I never underestimate people's abilities to slow things down. So I do think that it's not going to be quite as different as you might think in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. But what I do think is very probably going to take place is that their jobs will be made easier, because I see just so much wonderful, many wonderful tools. And I mean, face it, the job of a teacher is really hard. It's very time consuming. It's challenging. And what Gen AI can do is add in wonderful ways, nice tools to make teachers' lives easier and to help their teaching be better. So I think we will see a movement towards that in the next decade, and that will make me very happy.
Great. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Michael, for your thoughts, for this great report, which you can all download from our website. Thank you, Barbara, for indeed giving us your Sunday evening in Michigan to be with us on this webinar here in New Zealand, where it's already Monday. And thank you both for a great discussion. I think we learned a lot about AI. And for those of you who are interested, I mean, you will find lots of ideas in this report. I think you can look forward to reading that report. And we look forward to having you, Barbara, here in New Zealand next year for half a year with our team to do more work, not just on AI, but on learning how to learn, on teaching us how to teach, and to really inform New Zealand's education debates. But for now, that's what we had time for. I thank you both for joining us. I thank everybody online, and we had at the peak about 200 people on this webinar for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the insights that you gained. And until next time, that's it from us. Bye-bye.